Chapter 5 concerns the formation of limbs in tetrapods. Tetrapods are the organisms having 4 limbs. So, of course, it includes also the formation of limbs in humans, since the human is a tetrapod. So, the formation of limbs is a fundamental process in developmental biology. Different studies focused on the formation of the limbs, how the limbs are formed in different organisms, and what are the factors that can make the limbs, the morphology of the limbs different in different organisms. But in terms of structure, in tetrapods, they look more or less the same in terms of bone arrangements and in terms of the conservation of the pattern of bones present. Sometimes we have between the digits we have webbing conserved, and it's a kind of structure due to the evolution, and it will allow the adaptation of the organism to its environment. Especially we find those in ducts, for example, in aquatic turtles. So we have this webbing that will facilitate the swimming for these organisms, while for example in chicken we don't have this webbing. This webbing is present early and then it will be degenerated to form separated digits. So limbs formation occupied a main field of development, and since it's a fundamental process in developmental biology, so studying limbs formation started very long time ago, by the time of Charles Darwin, by 1859. So by this time he published his famous book, The Origin of Species. It's about natural selection and how organisms developed during evolution, with the different environmental modifications happening in the different times. So, and at that time nothing was known about DNA, about the cell components, about the genes controlling development and controlling the structure of limbs, etc. So, but at that time what Charles Darwin did is that he compared the formation of limbs in different organisms. Okay, and he came up with this famous phrase or sentence showing. So he said that what can be more curious than the hand of a man for grasping, the mole for digging, the leg of the horse, the paddle of the porpoise, the wing of the bat. So he thought, but just by comparing these limbs and these different organisms, he supposed that all of them must be constructed on the same bone pattern, and they should include similar bones at the same positions. And at that time he had no clue how to validate this hypothesis. It was just a hypothesis. But sometimes later, with the anthropologists and the different studies done on formation of limbs in tetrapods, they found out that this is true, and all limbs constructed, they share the same all the limbs in tetrapods share same bone patterns, and they are coming from one ancestor. So if you look, for example, here at the tetrapod limbs in human, cat, whale and bat, you see we have homologous structures. They are homologous because they share, for example, here if you can see, they share the same pattern of the bones. Okay, the same pattern, all the bones are the same, in the same arrangement, in the same order, but the shape, the length or the size of these different bones are different from one organism to another one, and this is due to the function of the limb in these different organisms. For example, in all we have humerus, then radius, ulna, then carpus, metacarpus and phalanges. For example, in cats you see that the the metacarpals are vertical while phalanges are horizontal, and this is helps out this organism form the standing up position, because it's standing up on the four legs or the four limbs. In ways, you see the phalanges are very long while all other bones are very short, like humerus, radius, carpals, etc. And this is important, okay, the phalanges, the length of these phalanges is important for allowing this whale to swim easily and to move in the aquatic environments. Regarding bats, you see the bones are present in the same patterns as other organisms or other tetrapods, but the size and especially the width of the bones is much smaller, okay. So and this is very important because the bat is flying, and this will facilitate the flight movement of this animal, since when the bones are heavy, this will be noisy for the flight. So this is a kind of adaptation of the bat to the flight life. So here in the field of limbs formation and the patterning of the bones, so many questions can be asked, but not all of them have answers yet. So for example, we can ask, how can the growth of limbs is so precise? What makes, for example, the limbs terminate at some point their growth during embryonic development? Or how is that we have 4 limbs and not 6 or 8? How is that the little finger develops at one end and the thumb at the other end? Other questions like, how does the forelimbs or the anterior limbs grow differently than the hind limbs? For example, in human, why the anterior limbs are different than the legs or the posterior limbs? Of course, we don't have questions to all these. We don't have answers to all these questions, but it's a very large field of study. Many questions can be asked about the process of limbs formation. So here you should know that during the formation of limbs, limbs are formed by bones, and bones should have a specific order and a specific spatial arrangement of the different bone tissues to form a bone pattern. We always talk about a pattern formation of bone, okay. It means the processes of by which the cells or the embryonic cells will be arranged by order. So we talk about a spatial arrangement of the bone, the differentiated bone tissue to form the limb. So you should know that in order to get this functional bone pattern, okay, we should not only have differentiation of the cartilage cells, the chondrocytes, into osteocytes. Okay, it's not the whole process. But here, during the formation of bones, chondrocytes should be differentiated into osteocytes, which are the differentiated bone cells. And these osteocytes should be arranged according to temporal spatial orientation. They should be arranged in terms of space or location or position, and in terms of time, okay. And this will generate a functional bone. So for example, if we look at this limb skeletal pattern, any limb is formed by 3 segments. Stylopod, which is the first segment, the most proximal segment. For example, if we are talking about the arm, the stylopod is the humerus, okay. It's the same in human or in chicken wing, for example. The humerus is the stylopod. Then we have the zeugopod, is the ulna and radius for the arm. ulna and radius. Then we have the wrist bones and the fingers. They form the most distal segment called otopod. Okay, if we are talking about leg, for example, stylopod is the femur, you know them from the anatomy. The zeugopod is the tibia and the fibula, okay, the two bones of the lower part of the leg. And then we have the ankle and the toes, means the tarsals and the toes. These form the otopod, while carpals and fingers form the otopods of the arm. Okay, so this is called the limb skeletal pattern, divided into 3 segments: stylopod, zeugopod, otopod. And in different organisms, it seems that we have the same skeletal pattern, that formed by 1 bone, 2 bones, many bones. Okay, this is called 1 bone, 2 bone, many bones: stylopod, zeugopod, otopod. It doesn't matter if we are talking about 4 limbs like arms, or hind limbs like legs.